Okay, hello everybody, and welcome again to Consumption Conversations. And with us today is Manu Mathai from India. And welcome, Manu. And would you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Valerie, and thanks for this invitation. I'm Manu Mathai, and I've been essentially a teacher and researcher on about the intersections of human development and sustainability. That's been my long-standing academic interest and research interest. So that's what I've been teaching and writing about for since the early 2000s. Yeah, and I've also, I guess, bring to it a lens around technology choice. And my doctoral work was around energy policy, energy and environmental policy. So I was very interested in at the intersection about technology, development, sustainability, and energy as the overall kind of framing, thematic focus, right? So that's kind of, where I come from.
Great. So who do you think in that case, from your point of view and your background, who do you think are the major agents and directions of change towards sustainable lifestyles that you would like to see promoted?
Right. And I think I would go with the two. I guess the big fissure, I suppose, in the space is behavior and structure, right? In a very abstract sense, there's a whole host of research and teaching that focuses on changing human behavior and nudging behavior and so forth. And then there's also the conversation really coming from what you would broadly call researchers in the political economy space who are interested in the structures within which people live and make their lives, right? So I don't think you can exclude one or the other. And I think both have to learn to speak to each other far more than they have tended to do in the past. I guess it's largely an academic, a function of how academia is organized. They've tended to be different departments or spaces or ideological orientations. I think you need to bring both of them back into conversation. So that's a very abstract.
You think if you take it into in the context of India now, can you give us some idea of how these more abstract or
Yes.
general approaches to sustainable lifestyle that is all around the world? How would you put it in the context in India? After all, you're the biggest population in the world and the biggest countries. So it's very important to know, how do you see it and what do you see happening in the direction in India?
Yeah. So I think let's take an example of urbanization, right? And as we urbanize, are we going to build infrastructure that's going to commit more and more of us to driving around in private vehicles? Or are we going to build urban infrastructure that kind of builds on, improves upon the existing landscape, land use patterns, right? So, and we have a choice here because India is, like you said, it's 1,400 billion people living on land that's 1/3 the size of the United States or 1/3 the size of China. It's very dense. It's very densely populated landscape. And what that means is distances tend to be smaller. I mean, at least in the urban context, distances tend to be smaller. There's ample opportunity to have non-motorized forms of transport, innovative forms of public transportation. All of these things can be exploited far more than they've been exploited now. So I think an immediate question for us in India around energy consumption in the form of urban mobility would be how we build our cities. Are we going to build them first and foremost for walking and cycling, and then for the motor car, buses, and then finally for the motor car, right? If you look at the evidence, the data suggests that only 3 or 4%, this is the 2011 census data, only 3 or 4% of urban Indians drive in a motor car to work. That's 2011. So we're 2025. So fast forward 15, 14 years, right? Let's say we double that. Let's say that's 8% or 10% even now. What I'm saying is 90% of urban Indians do not drive in a car to work, right? That's pretty stunning. And if you were to use that simple data point to inform your infrastructure investments, you would end up with a very different future as opposed to being, and this is, I think, the intersection of development, technology choice, and sustainability, right? And the whole political economy framing of this. How are these investment choices being made? And I think that's an important question for us to ask. Yeah.
So who is the crucial agent in India for investing in non-vehicular transport and enabling walkability, cyclability, and of
Yeah.
course the public transport? Who are the agents, and where and how do we get a higher level of investment to get a very efficient system going?
Wow, I think it's a very good question. And currently, I think one of the challenges that India is still kind of working through is what we call the third tier of governance, right? So you have the federal, the union government, the central government, as we call it in India, then the provincial or the state government, and then the municipal or the city government, right? And according to the constitution, there is a considerable level of autonomy and decision making that should rest with the municipal government. But that's something that came into the constitution in 1992 when it was amended, the 74th Amendment, as they call it, right? But we are still working. It's a lot of work to be done in terms of realizing the actual bring that to life, right? So making it actually a reality. So what I'm saying there is right now, urban design, land use planning, infrastructure investment in the city aren't really being driven by people who live in the city, right?
Who
It's
are they
it's
being driven by?
it's really driven by, I guess, governments at the state level, and perhaps even by guidance or policies from the national level, right? So I think you would find a fair amount of interest in big kind of infrastructure investment, like big ticket infrastructure investments that are very expensive, but somehow overlook the most obvious things, right? Which is actually having wall-to-wall walkability. If I were to take the city as, functioning wall-to-wall walkability, that like a 6-year-old kid who is reasonably oriented in the world can leave home in the morning, walk to school, come back, walk back, right? And that's how safe and accessible the city ought to be. I mean, if you solve the problem for a 6 or 7-year-old kid, you've essentially solved the problem for everybody, right? For 99% of the people, right? So I think we're quite a ways from there, because I think we're still captured, and I think I would like to connect it to the development imagination, I suppose, that we've inherited, adopted fairly uncritically, right? From what does a developed country look like? And I think the most powerful examples that I think we've taken on fairly casually are from North America or Europe, where we think we all drive around in cars on freeways, and cars, 5 cars parked outside our driveways, and you just drive around and you have motorized access and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, that's a very powerful part of the imagination, right? And I don't think there's an easy fix to this, but what I will say is that there is, and depending on which city you are, and there's a fair amount of debate and discussion and civil society engagement and even sensitization amongst the government about these kinds of questions. But I think we're very far from arriving at a situation where the citizens of a city, which is the 90% of the people, for example, who are not driving in a car, having the ability to interrogate land use decisions, investment plans.
So
That's
you would you would be in you think there would be agency to get to a sustainable city, even if it's not necessarily using that terminology, but if it came to jumping over maybe the stage which was the mistaken stage in
yes,
Western society, because the
yeah,
opportunity is still there to jump over that and not go in that direction, jump to the
yes,
post-motorized city,
yes,
which is now being favored as a 15-minute city, but you have it there if you
yeah,
would reinforce it and bring it to the municipal level and encourage public participation and at a community level. So is
yes,
there public participation? Is the community involved? Are people involved
yeah,
in the municipal decision making?
yes. So I mean, like I said, it's a very big country, so, and it's difficult to kind of provide a statement about all of India. But I would say I live in Bangalore, so I'm quite familiar with what's happening in Bangalore, which is in South India, and we've had a very long-standing interest and engagement. Sorry, one second. Somebody's calling me. We've had a very long-standing in investment among civil society, academics, activists, and so forth, who've essentially just tried to bring life to what's called the 74th Amendment, right? Which is the amendment to the Constitution I referenced earlier about devolution of power to the city, right? So there's a thriving ecosystem of people and organizations, and and they do certainly intersect with the political class and the bureaucratic class and so on and so forth. So this, what I guess what I'm trying to point to is, yes, there is hope and there is initiative and there is action. But one must also realize this is a country that's officially speaks 22 different languages, has a per capita income of about $2,400 a year compared to, say, the US at $89,000 or $85,000. It's 1,400 billion people. I mean, it's a very complex space, right? So change here is going to look different. So, and it's going to take time, right? But are the issues visible? Are they being debated? Are the choices kind of coming into more clarity and resolution? Yes. Now we have to work our way through the complexity that is this country and the change and the dynamism, etc., to make that choice, right? And that's not going to be a very straightforward or easy thing. I personally, when I talk to students, I often frame it as a generational endeavor, not something that's going to, you pass a legislation somewhere and hey, things change. But I really, I want to go back to this point. 1,400 million people in a democratic polity that speaks officially 22 languages, but if you break it up, hundreds of languages and dialects, pretty much every conceivable religion on the planet. I mean, it's just the complexities are enormous, right? So I think appreciating what change means here, I think is something we should pay more attention to, right? And I don't think we necessarily have a ready lens from, say, the developed world's experience to do that, because these are, generally speaking, smaller countries and much more wealthier economies, right?
Do you have any social and cultural lenses that you would
Yeah.
say, let's look at the social and cultural lens of this part of Indian
Yes.
society, which
Yeah.
could be an example that would be worthwhile knowing about and worthwhile
Yeah.
looking at how it operates?
Absolutely. I mean, see, I think one of the most interesting things for me, I've wondered about this when I lived in the West for a number of years, and back and forth, etc. So, meat consumption is a ceremonial activity. And unlike the dollar menu at McDonald's, which I was introduced to when I lived in the US, right? You eat, it's kind of, you eat a huge chunk of meat every day, all the time, right? I personally eat meat, and I enjoy eating meat, but I've also lived in contexts, right, where in this country where you it's a weekend thing, right? You said it's not about being non-vegetarian or vegetarian. I think that's a false formulation of the issue. It's not about being vegan or vegetarian or non-vegetarian. I think it is about moderating one's consumption, right? Figuring out what's a normal, healthy form of consuming meat, right? And I think it's a complex question because you are taking life to eat an animal, and there's a certain respect and responsibility that should go with it. But you are also a human being that's evolved to eat meat, and there's a certain sanction that comes from that view as well. And I think where we tripped up, I suppose, is the industrialization of food and the cheap and the can I just formulate a word? The cheapification of the calorie, right? The fact that we made calories so cheap. I don't know what is a quarter pounder burger or something at McDonald's is probably, I don't know, 300, 400 calories, I'm guessing. It's a huge amount of energy that you're consuming for $1 or $2. I don't know what it is now in the US, but it used to be very cheap. That's unreasonable. You can't do that. You can't just make stuff so cheap, right? And that there's a whole political economy around how you make stuff so cheap, right? I think the industrialization of food and the fact that it's become so removed from people's lives, right? You just kind of modify it and just go into supermarket, pull it out, put it in the microwave, eat it, or go to the fast foods. I think if you're talking about Indian culture, there is, I think, still a culture around the ceremonial consumption of meat, right? And I want to emphasize it's not about eating meat or not eating meat. I really think that's a false way of looking at it. It's about understanding one's responsibility to oneself and the other humans and other life, right? Not just only other humans, right? Other life too, right?
Does that come understanding what is the right, where do you think it's coming, where is it going to come from? Is it going to come from the family structure, the group community, the religious affiliation structure, imitating the Western world and saying, you know, this is a status symbols? Where is the where will we look for
Right.
cultural and social change that will affect society in India over the
Right.
next decade?
See, I mean, a lot of it resides already within the ecosystem. It's there. I think the concern that we have to worry about more is losing some of this, and we're losing all of it very rapidly, right? So if I were to just let me just take the example of, say, you know, the interest and the kind of affinity towards fast food, right? Is quite noticeable, right? And you know, you find, you know, I think there is a risk that we can lose this, right? But I think very often families, if you're generally cooking at home, families tend to still, you know, have some notion of what you've inherited from your parents and grandparents and so on and so forth, right? So there's that pre kind of, you know, the kind of the tsunami of development and modernization that's washing over us, right? There are still cultural practices and memories and understandings that come from days prior to that. So I think there's a hybridization possibly going on there. And I think there's hope. If you're conscious of it, I think we can actually sustain some of this, right? So what I'm saying, I'll just make one more example. So we have all the big kind of fast food chains, like in Bangalore City, you have all the big fast food chains, you name it, right? Uh, uh, but what I also have noticed with some level of satisfaction is these tend to be places where people go on an outing with the family. It's not like my daily food place, right? Right. And I think that's a reasonable way of, it's been about 20 years since the big chains have come into India, right? And I don't see this as my staple lunch place, right? I might go there with my kids on a Friday evening because they want to pile on junk food, and fine, okay, I don't want to be you know, paranoid about it. I think that's a reasonable relationship to have with that kind of food, right? As opposed to this is my lunch and breakfast every day. So I think there is possibly some hybridization that's going on between what existed and continues to exist and this kind of wave that's washing over us, right? And I think different cities, different parts of the country, different religious traditions, etc., would find their own way through this. And another thing I'll just say about religious traditions is most traditions in India have notions of fasting. I mean, India is a very religious country, by the way. I mean, whether you're looking at any particular religion, as opposed to, say, Europe or North America and so forth, right? So religious practice is still a prominent part of, you know, one's life, and observances around that, right? So there's routinely, you know, if you're kind of fasting days of the week and this, that, and the other. So all sorts of communities have various ways in which they've engaged things. But I see these as, you can look at them theologically, you can also look at them as forms of moderation, right, of life and consumption, right? So I think there's a lot to draw upon from these spaces.
So, if there any recognition of that in policy at any of the levels of policy, that you actually are interested not to lose the staple diet, not to lose the tradition, festival, social, cultural, religious aspects,
Right.
which are important
Yes.
for the individual and for the community, and which add much joy and
Yes.
in life in
Yes.
every country, and in many cases your conversation is very interesting, because I came across that in Taiwan. They wanted to get their local population to actually go back to eating more of the staple food,
Yes.
because there has been too much movement
Yeah.
over to the fast food, and they
Yes.
have actually recognized that what they need to do is actually get back get people back to the staple foods.
Right,
What you're
right.
saying is we have the fast foods, but they're not too replacing the staple foods. So we have the opportunity, actually, if we emphasized the importance of the staple
Yes,
food. Perhaps that would link it to
yes,
a health concern. Would
yes.
that be a link relevant to tradition and health to the population?
Yeah, yes, I think absolutely. And I think there are a number of initiatives as well. There's a considerable recognition, and I think even government initiatives around these ideas, right? One more point I just make about the fast food story I was telling you is that it is in relative terms, in relation to per capita income, it is still expensive, right? So the consumers that you tend to see in these spaces tend to be obviously people who can afford. So you're really looking at the top decile of the population, which is still 140 million people, but that's where you are. You're not talking about 1,260 outside of that. So there is that kind of issue as well, but there's also an increasing recognition of health impacts, because non-communicable disease, whether it's diabetes or high blood pressure, the diseases of the heart, are, are increasingly obesity. These are increasingly concerns in the Indian context, right? And obesity especially is really a concern. So I think the level of awareness, even amongst the high income bracket, right, about just the kind of the gazillion pounds of sugar in a Coke is there. I think people recognize these things, right? And having said that, there's also therefore in that kind, if I talk about the top decile, there's also this kind of interest in health foods, right? And one of the big markers of that is not so much as meat or no meat, but this return to what you would call millets. I don't know if that's a word that's familiar to you. Yeah, so millets, as opposed to we've had a transformation of the Indian diet from millets, which predominated our cuisine, even a century ago, and thousands of varieties of rice as well that were prevalent across the country. Over 100,000 apparently by some estimates. Yeah, but after the kind of what we call the Green Revolution transformation in the 1960s, which is a very interesting story in its own right and complicated story as well. Our food kind of thing narrowed down. The plate really was constricted. We became much more narrow. We started eating really a handful of varieties of white refined rice and wheat. And out went all the millets that were much more nutritious in terms of fiber, more nutritious in terms of the proportion of micronutrients, whether it's iron or other kind of zinc or whatever else you're interested in, and also were much more suitable for. See, we had a monsoonal landscape, which means we get rain for about 3-4 months a year, right? So agriculture has to mimic that availability of water, and millets are much more suitable for growing in contexts that are more arid, right? They don't have to have irrigation as a prerequisite for cultivation, right? So now there is what's called, the government of India has called a millet mission, where they're trying to promote the revival of millets, and I think that's a wonderful idea, right? But what I'm also observing, perhaps more anecdotally, is that millets kind of tend to be quite expensive now. They're a bit of this the health food. Been labeled the health food, right? And I think there's an inequality in the system, therefore, as a result of that, because what's cheap and available is just white rice,
That's
right?
an
Um,
excellent subject, and it has come up actually in other contexts. And whether it's millet or whether it's rice based,
yes,
but the move to the white refined rice,
yes,
wheat, whatever,
yeah,
is very, and the loss of the
yes,
traditional healthier diet
yes,
is actually a major issue.
it
And
is.
I'm very happy to hear that the government has a millet mission. That's great. Does the government
Mhm.
have any other policies which you would like to bring into the conversation, because they're really relevant to what you would
Yeah.
think is the right direction?
I mean, a few years ago, the government, the very catchy abbreviation, it's called Lifestyles for the Environment, right? Was really around kind of environment-friendly lifestyles, which to do with diet, etc., etc. But I don't think, I mean, I haven't seen or heard much of it in as the years have gone by. I think perhaps they've gotten carried away with other more pressing concerns and so forth, and I think they've also really tend to think of sustainability maybe in renewable energy capacity terms or stuff like that, right? But I haven't. I mean, there was a fair amount of interest about this thing a few years ago, right? But I don't hear much going on that front anymore. Yeah.
Okay, and then lastly in our conversation, Manu, what would you like to see raised for discussion in the SCORAI Global Network?
Right. Maybe I just preface that by saying, something around, how would we think about sustainable consumption, right? And there is, I would broadly say there is the prescriptive option where I, as an expert, determine what a sustainable level of consumption is, and then I kind of get that into legislation or kind of use that to nudge behavior and so on and so forth. That's one way we've approached it. I think that's a dominant way in which we've approached these things. I think perhaps an alternative to that is to think of sustainability in a relational sense, right? And here I'm calling upon the notion of justice, right? The moment my consumption steps on your toes, it becomes unsustainable, right? Now, in the abstract, that's a very powerful it's a very powerful imagination image, right? How do you make it practical, right? I think that's the big challenge we have. So what if I want to bring something back into the SCORAI world or sustainable consumption conversation? One of those things is really to think about this really as a relational question. It's not so much a limited individual choice to be determined by experts who know best, right? I think that input can be complementary to the conversation and what people do, but there is a need to revive the notion of the fact that there is a common shared human experience. Again, I'm being slightly abstract and vague, but I hope you can imagine what I mean in a daily sense. And because it's all the more important because we are moving away from that very quickly in many ways, right? I think we're shunning that realization, and that will be to our detriment, definitely, right? The more we lose that common empathy to each other. So I think to connect that, I hope I can connect it to what I would leave SCORAI with. I think, and I'll just say, I've known about SCORAI for 20 years as a grad student when I was in the US. That's when I first learned about SCORAI. But I never really figured out how my interest in development and sustainability interconnected with the sustainable consumption focus, right? And I think maybe, and stuff I've written, etc., over the years, I've tried to make that connection. I think the way I would, if I were to make a suggestion, would be to think about really as a question of development, human development, not necessarily about sustainable consumption. Front end the questions around human well-being, human flourishing, human development, and what that means. Engage in the processes, modalities, governance complexities around how you bring about something like that, right? A human well-being. That will bring us automatically to a sustainable consumption arrangement, right? I think engineering it in the reverse direction risks coming across as being too prescriptive. I know better than you, and that is having a political pushback.
Yes,
right?
Alienating.
Exactly. Nice word.
Yes,
yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Manu. That was a great conversation, and it's you brought in different approaches, different aspects, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I wish you a good day, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Valerie. Thanks very much. Bye. Bye.